This is Aspen Waite Media, and today we're bringing you the second part of our exciting new series, 8-part series, which is charting the birth of the English nation from somewhere around 450, when the Anglo-Saxons first came into England, really, through to that momentous sea change that was the Battle of Hastings in 1066. My name is Paul Waite, and I'm joined, as always, by the great Viking himself. It's almost like Harold Hardrada never died, and he was preserved for 1,000 years to come back in the form that is Callum. So I feel it's such an honour for Aspen Waite to have such a great Viking warrior present on the show. So hello, Callum. How are you today?
I'm good, thanks, chap. How are you?
I see you're not talking in your Viking voice, which is quite good because it can be a bit disconcerting when Callum goes into his full Norse thing. He's quite threatening when he goes berserker. I've been seen to run many miles away from him. These days it becomes a limp. Anyway, so without further ado, so we're now back in England in somewhere around the year 600. Just to set the scene from last week. Britain became a Romano-British kingdom, very much absorbed into the culture of the Romans. The Romans then had bigger things to worry about, so they basically upped and left Britain, and that took place in about 410 AD. Because they were being attacked by the Goths, the Visigoths, the Vandals, and various Germanic tribes. Interestingly, the Anglos and the Saxons and the Jutes, etc., had been prominent players as mercenaries in the Roman armies, particularly in Britain, and so the peoples had been used to travelling to the British Isles over quite a long period of time. Because of the dominance of the Roman culture and also the inherently tribal nature of the British tribes prior to the Romano conquest, when the Romans left, this left the island pretty vulnerable, I would say. And of course, the North European peoples, it's best to call them that, looked with cunning and fond eyes across the seas to the beautiful green countryside that is England. And so in over 450 to 600, etc., the Anglos, Saxons, Jutes, and Frisians really are the main peoples here. They travelled over from the area that is now Denmark, Germany, Frisia, a little bit of Holland, and initially probably were more sort of conquering type people coming over as with war bands, and then as they became more established, then they would bring their women and their children, and the farmers would follow. And so we get to a point by today where basically the Anglo-Saxon culture is now dominant. Very interesting, as we discussed, very interesting thing in history, because at no point does it seem from the records we have that they ever became anything like the dominant people. They were heavily outnumbered, even at their peak, by the indigenous people of the time. But I suppose because there was no real solidity to the structure of post-Roman British people, effectively the Britons that stayed in England basically became Saxon. I mean, that's the only way they basically became no different to the invader. And so I think was England referred to as the Heptarchy, Callum? I think that's right, isn't it? Do you heard of that that phrase?
It does ring a bell, but to be honest, I'm not 100% sure on that one.
I think Heptarchy means 7 kingdoms. So by the time we get into the 7th century, we've basically got Kent, Sussex, Essex, Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex, with Cornwall referred to as the West Welsh. And then, interestingly, considering our Waite paternal line, Callum, Cumbria itself was never actually part of that whole structure, and was actually more aligned to Strathclyde, for instance, and probably was looking north more than south.
Yeah.
So as I say, we get to a point where England has become dominated by the invading North German tribes, let's call them that. So you've done a lot of work on how these people sort of operated, their structure of government, how they went
Yep.
about their daily lives, the things they ate. So um, let's start off with what do these people look like? What did they do? What was their what? How do they have fun? What did they eat? These sort of things.
Okay, so the general consensus is they were very tall people. On the whole, they were fair-haired. In terms of what they would carry around, they would have lots of long tunics, round shields, spears and swords were their favourite weapons. Helmets. So just to sort of tie into everything nice and neatly. So obviously, when they first arrived on the scene, there were lots and lots of Roman towns all over the place. And I do really think it's really interesting that they chose not to use these at all.
Yeah.
But I think you can see why. I mean, these were very culturally advanced people, but it would have been very, very hard for them to integrate themselves into the Roman towns. You've got to bear in mind that the Roman towns at the time wouldn't have been dissimilar to, or a Roman house, it wouldn't have been dissimilar to explaining a house of modern day. So Roman houses were made of brick or stone. They had tiled roofs. They even had glass in their windows and had underfloor heating.
Yep.
So I mean, it's quite really. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, the Romans were amazing people. I mean, to hear that in modern day and to hear that this was over 1,000 years ago is really quite astonishing stuff.
Yep.
So I think the Anglo-Saxons just didn't understand the Roman ways. And so the towns, the villas, the streets, and the baths were often forgotten. They fell into ruin, covered with weeds, which in itself would have really seemed quite like mysterious and magical. 100 or 200 years afterwards, to have been wandered through these places would have seemed really quite eerie, I imagine. And I know that there are some tales from Saxons and Vikings which explain some of the Roman towns, such as Bath, as being like ancient places built by giants.
Yeah.
But anyway, I digress. So the Anglo-Saxons lived in small villages. They built lots of villages. They built their houses out of mainly wood, with roofs thatched with straw.
Yeah.
They really utilised the fact that at the time Britain was completely covered with forest. You know, so everything they could they made with wood really. Their houses only had one room where everyone ate, slept, cooked, and entertained. All of their houses were built facing the sun to get as much heat and light as possible. So they would have had a small village with several houses. The biggest house in the village would have been called the Hall, which was the chief's house, and he would have lived there with all of his warriors.
Yeah.
The hall would have been long, wide, and smoky. They would have had a fire and a stone in the middle. The window slits were called eye holes. On the walls there would have been shields, antlers, things that they had won through conquest, and large beasts that they had slain. If there was like a particularly large wolf or something, they would put that up on its wall. The would have been quite dirty on the floor, I imagine. They often would have kept their animals inside with them in the colder months.
Definitely.
But on the whole, the villages were quite small. You wouldn't have had more than a couple of hundred people living there at a time.
Okay. And did these people often eat together with you see in sort of films and things like Last Kingdom and the Vikings, scenes of the Great Hall and people congregating around. Is that more true, or did the average Anglo-Saxon person eat their provisions in their own little dwellings?
Well, it's definitely true to say that they loved having company, and they loved having parties. In fact, they have some great words for it. Actually, we can talk about that in a bit. They had a word that they really liked, that in Old English was "cum fiorum," and that meant house guest or visitor. Cum, the cum part just means comer, so pretty straightforward. And fiorum sort of means like strangers' supplies. So this would have been like a common word that they would have used so that you know, they would have said, oh, you know, we need to arrange for the Cumfioran, and they would have had sort of meat and ale and mead and everything arranged. So yeah, they definitely would have had lots and lots of feasts in the chief's hall. Definitely. The food was cooked over a fire in the middle of the house, where the meat was roasted. They drank primarily ale and mead. The ale would have been fairly weak because they would have drank it all day long. Obviously, the rivers at the times were quite polluted and stuff. So really, from the moment they got up in the morning to the moment they went to bed at night, they drank ale. They deliberately made it quite weak because obviously otherwise they would have all been
drunk all the time,
stumbling around. Yeah, which would have been quite fun, but not very productive, I expect. So their main strong alcohol they drank was mead. Obviously, it's made of honey, and they would have drank it in great goblets and drinking horns. As I said, touched on last week, while they were doing this, a minstrel would usually play harp, and they would often be singing songs of battles and of heroes. It's worth mentioning some people did drink wine. But all of this was imported from the Mediterranean, so you would have had to have been a very, very wealthy, you know, one of the kings of the kingdoms of the seven kingdoms. You would have really had to have been them or are very up thane to afford such a thing.
So you talked about the meat. So what sort of meat did they eat, and did that include game and fowl and fish, etc.?
Yeah, so the food the meat that would have been primarily eaten at the time was boar, deer, and pig. So pigs, they obviously were very great farmers. The Anglo-Saxons were great farmers. They farmed all the same animals that we farm today, but they very much liked their pork. What with beef and chickens and stuff, they would use the cows and the chickens primarily more for, like milk and eggs. And then once they got old, then they would kill them and they would eat the meat. Whereas they used to farm pigs, just for the meat itself. Other than that, they would have hunters in the village, and they would go out and they would hunt boar and deer. Those are the three meats. They also used to eat quite a lot of fish. So, from the rivers and the seas. Yeah. So quite a diverse lot of
muddy fish.
Yeah, obviously, from the rivers, but they would for the people that live near the sea. For the people that live near the sea, they would fish in the sea as well. So that would have probably been a bit tastier. But I think it's they really were quite good farmers. They cultivated lots of cereals and stuff. They would have eaten bread with every single meal.
Yeah.
They farmed lots of wheat and rye, barley, oats. They ate lots of porridge, and they also used the oats as animal feed. The vegetables that would have mainly been eaten at the time, obviously, there were no, exotic foods. So they didn't have potatoes, tomatoes, bananas, pineapples. They would have eaten carrots, parsnips, cabbages, peas, beans, onions. They would have made lots of meat stews with the leftover barley from the ale, and made lots of healthy stews. I think for our modern taste buds, it's very worth mentioning that obviously they didn't have sugar at all in Britain at the time. So they really relied on honey and things like parsnips to sweeten everything. So the Anglo-Saxons loved honey. They used to put honey on everything. They really did. You can imagine you go to the hall in the evening. There'd be a big fire in the middle, probably with a pig on roasting, and your typical meal would you'd probably have a bowl of you'd have pork, carrots, parsnips, cabbage, peas, beans, onions, and then they also often ate things like apples, cherries, plums. I think it's sorry.
So can I overview at that point, please, Mr. Viking? So just for the viewers, I think so one of the things they used to eat a lot of was peas pudding. So lots of very pea-based things. So they would love mushy peas and chips, I expect. An interesting thing, in the same way they didn't have potatoes, the carrots, of course, weren't orange. The carrots, I believe, are either white or a sort of a purpley colour. I think that's right to say that. And of course, the thing that's quite interesting, Callum, is you think about the environmental issues we have today, and people quite rightly being concerned about greenhouse gases and pollution. I find it rather bizarre that just to set the scene here now, I think this is quite interesting for people listening to our little show. They estimate that around 400 AD, the population of England was about 4 million. But by the time of the Norman conquest in 1066, there weren't even 2 million people in the country. And I think no one will ever know exactly for sure why that happened, but there are some reasons for that. So one of them would be there were plagues and pestilence prevailing throughout the whole of Europe throughout the period we're in today, which would have decimated the population. Obviously, the life expectancy at this time was very poor. In fact, the average Anglo-Saxon was expected to live for about 35 years. 48% of Anglo-Saxons didn't live beyond the age of 10. So I believe. And of course, once you got to a decent age, then I think if you got to 20, you had a very, very, very good chance of getting to 40. And if you got to 30, you would almost certainly live to 50. And I've done a bit of research on some of the more famous people of this period. And you do get people living to 70, etc. And of course, if you look at our favourite little Anglo-Saxon Dane, Uhtred of Bebbanburg, he's still fighting well into his late 50s, for instance. So he's definitely not dead. I think it would be reasonable to assume, and disagree with me if I'm wrong in saying this. One of the reasons why the water would have been unsafe would have been their own ignorance. So because they had the animals, basically, with them so closely with them, the animals would clearly have done their business, shall we say, and that would have polluted the water that was available to them. And as you say, that meant pretty much that it was very rare for people in this period to actually drink fresh water, and therefore they had no choice but to drink ale, which of course carried on right through right into really the 19th century, I would say. That sort of thing. One of the more gory things I've read about, which is very interesting, is I think it's true to say that the average Anglo-Saxon had up to 100 tapeworms in their body. And I've read about people with them coming out of their eyes and all sorts of other orifices. And there was I read a quote in I think in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. It's something about for every 3 calories that the Anglo-Saxon ingested, it was 2 for the tapeworms and 1 for them. And so it was very rare for an Anglo-Saxon of this period to be obese. So they tended to be quite lean and mean, and obviously probably not very well because they were so blighted by these tapeworms, etc. So disease was quite rife. Obviously, didn't have any antibiotics or anything really other than natural medicine. I think the other thing that's quite fun, I don't know how much you know about this, is you were talking about bread and how important it was, and of course it was probably the staple diet of the real poor people of this period. But they used to put some really, really funny things in it, like hallucinogenic things. So you almost like had cannabis bread and like tripping bread. I don't know that they realised that's what they were doing, but because they obviously used what was available to them. Have you any experience of that?
Well, not particularly. I'm sure what they would have. I expect it was mushrooms, psilocybin mushrooms. I expect that they
things
would
like
have
bergamot and all sorts of the things that go Glastonbury things, you'd call them.
There are lots of spores and stuff that have a slightly hallucinogenic effect. Obviously, I'm sure like a lot of people listening will have heard of even if you find like antique books and you open them up, even the spores that grow on antique books on the paper can give you a mild hallucinogenic effect. Now, obviously, we know that it's more associated with Scandinavians, but Anglo-Saxons and the Norse people, they did partake in the taking of psilocybin mushrooms, which obviously some used to help get them into a berserker state. But I mean, these were people that they worked hard, but they partied harder, you know. So, you know, we were talking about their parties in the halls. They would have definitely, along with drinking their mead and their ale, they would have had psilocybin mushrooms and stuff. And maybe, you know, some clever little baker thought, oh, I'll put a couple of these ingredients in the bread as well. Yeah, I haven't read anything about that myself specifically, but I'm sure you're giving Drew some ideas.
Yeah, I think next thing I'd like you to talk about is the sort of way they structured their society and how they were ruled. And I think it's it's fair to say one of the reasons actually why, without giving too much away in future shows, one of the reasons why the Normans were able to fairly easily, without that many people actually take over England, was it was incredibly well run. Administratively, it was fantastic. We had a brilliant justice system. Everything, you know, the administration system was perfect. So tell us a little bit about that. So how, you know, were there local kings? Was there a local lord? You know, how did the society sort of structure itself from bottom up?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, as you said, Anglo-Saxon kings were prolific legislators, and a number of law codes survived from the 7th right up to the 11th century. The earliest laws have much in common with what we know as like continental Germanic law, including things like a personal injury tariff or compensation for various kind of bodily injuries, for example. Under 7th century Kentish law, the sum of 12 shillings was payable for cutting off an ear, 30 shillings for disabling somebody's shoulder, and 50 shillings for putting out an eye. You know, so as I said, they were really prolific legislators. Homicide required payment of what was known as the weregild, which translates to man price, a sum which varied according to social class. The Anglo-Saxon settlers had brought with them the Germanic system of blood feud, whereby the relatives of a murder victim could be expected to avenge them. One of the aims of the early laws was to reduce the number of revenge killings by substituting a scale of financial compensation. So, I mean, I think we have this idea of them as being, you know, it was of being like almost like a completely lawless society. I think it's tempting nowadays to see it like that. But really, it would have been quite similar to nowadays in terms of how they dealt with everyday situations. You couldn't just go up to somebody you disliked and kill them and there'd be no repercussions. As I said, you'd be heavily fined and punished just for, like injuring somebody's shoulder, for example, you know. Okay. The later Anglo-Saxon laws reflect the growing influence of the church, as, for instance, the introduction of fines or offences against religious officials, and a preference for mutilation over the death penalty in order to give the offender time to repent, which is nice. Laws were also issued to enforce religious practices such as infant baptism, fasting, Sunday observance, and practical benefits can be seen in the granting of religious festivals as holidays, things like that. Yeah, I think it's important to say that laws on marriage were fiercely regulated to forbid unions between relatives or those connected with godparents. It was very frowned upon. And whereas a woman who committed adultery during the 7th century would be penalised financially, but later on, under Canute's law, a woman would have actually lost their nose or their ears. Yeah. They would have had to pick one of them for adultery, which is obviously really quite brutal.
As seen on the scene in The Last Kingdom, I believe.
Yeah.
Was her name Judith? I think her name was.
Judith, yeah, she had her ear taken off, yeah.
So, is that? Can I interject now, Mr. Viking?
Yeah, no, of course, yeah.
So, I think it's worth pointing out just that the Anglo-Saxons were a West Germanic people. So the language they spoke was Proto-Germanic or West Germanic, depending on where you want to go. So various Germanic languages, Norse, for instance, is also Germanic, but coming off a different part of the family. Whereas German, for instance, High German, which became the Eins, zwei, drei German, comes from the same daddy language. So I think it's important. I find the language thing very interesting, and I've done quite a lot of research on this. As you know, I already am able to pronounce some words, noticeably ship, SCIP, and I think the most interesting thing with Anglo-Saxon, Old English, let's call it that, because that's better to call it Old English, is when you actually see it written down, it's often quite baffling. But when it's actually spoken, you can understand much better where the person's coming from. And I think it's true to say that roughly 48% of all the words in use today come from Old English. And one of the things I find very fascinating, I've been fortunate in my life I can probably count to 100 in about 10 languages, I would say. And of course, if you take German, the German for 12, for instance, is Zwölf, which is ZWELF. Whereas, for instance, an Anglo-Saxon would say 12, TWELF. So it's I think it's quite fascinating how language evolves, and so to be honest, because I've sort of taught myself a bit to talk to 100 in Welsh, for instance, in the last year, and the words for the Welsh words like pedwar would be one of the numbers. Obviously, it doesn't mean anything to us at all in terms of construction. That word has no derivation in any language I've certainly ever been taught. Whereas if you look at Old English, so 1, for instance, is an, 3 is tria, 5 is fif, 6 is six, and then you get to 20, for instance, which is twentia, and you say an and twentia, twa and twentia, 3 and twentia. So I think what's very interesting about that is I mentioned it on another live stream this morning, and when I quoted that, the people in the audience that could speak German said, "Oh, that sounds like German," and it does to a point. And I think the more relevant thing is it's more to do with the construction. If any of you have got a little bit of time, go and have a look at how, for instance, an Anglo-Saxon would say something like 6,541. It's absolutely extraordinary. They couldn't just say, so the Romans, for instance, would just write down probably 4 or 5 Roman numerals to say that. The Anglo-Saxon language was so cumbersome, they actually had to say something like 6,501 and 4 lots of 10. That's literally what they would have said, and in terms of how they would speak. So instead of saying, "Hello, Callum, would you like to have a drink with me?" they would say, "Callum, like to me drink." The verb would go at the end. So instead of saying Sally kicked the ball, they would say Sally the ball she kicked. Yeah. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think that's really, really interesting. So I think that's probably set the scene. I think it's enough on culture for today, and then we're going to sort of move in the second half of the show, sort of through the geography of the time, and in particular, we're going to the exciting bit about the Viking invasion. And obviously you and I both being a little bit Viking, it's quite exciting in our roots. So just painting the scene. So the oldest English kingdom is Kent. And to start off, Kent was the dominant powerhouse in the whole of England. And very interestingly, I know a character that you're very keen on, that you're going to talk about quite a lot later, Egbert, who was obviously, of course, the grandfather of King Alfred. Egbert was actually supposed to be the son of a Kentish nobleman called, I think his name was Earlman or something like that, that sort of name. I must admit, I'm a bit confused as to how being the son of a Kentish man got him to be the King of Wessex, but we might find that out next week. And if you don't know today, if you could find that out for me, because
I already know. I already know.
Oh, that's fantastic. So we'll do that in context rather than jump around. So
Yeah.
so Kent started the period as a dominant kingdom, and then over the period we're in, it sort of declined in its influence, not least because obviously it was quite a small kingdom. And then you had, roughly speaking, the Angles in East Anglia. The Saxons themselves, of course, were in Essex, Sussex, and what we now call Wessex. The Jutes, of course, were in Kent, and the Mercians would have been a sort of a combination, but the Saxons mainly, as I say, were in Essex, Sussex, and Wessex. So over the period after the Kentish domination, Mercia took over as the powerhouse in England, and certainly in the period prior to the Viking invasion, Mercia was a very large kingdom covering most of the north of England, a lot of the north of England, and certainly the sort of North Midlands, whole of the Midlands, places like Gloucestershire even. Gloucestershire, Shropshire, these sort of places, Herefordshire, would all have been places in Mercia. Of course, probably the dominant character of the period we're in today would have been Offa. And as I say, it's only really when we get to the sort of early part of the 9th century where Wessex starts to take over. So, what are your thoughts on that then, Callum?
Yeah, so I think it's important to note that Mercia and Wessex early on the whole were pretty friendly with one another. It was always much more seen as sort of Mercia against Northumbria and stuff. But Mercia's fate was always sort of fluctuating because it had so many borders with potential rivals. To the north, Northumbria, it's wet. To the west, it's the Welsh kingdoms, traditional enemies of the Saxons. To its east, East Anglia, and to the south, Wessex, which were probably over the whole course of, Anglo-Saxon England were the least aggressive towards Mercia. Mercia was probably the kingdom that was most consistently at war on the whole. Would you like me to give you just a little just brief synopsis of all the kingdoms, just so everyone sort of gets an idea?
Yeah, as long as it doesn't get in the way of our Viking bit, of course.
No, of course. No, I just want to say, so Northumbria was a region that stretched across the neck of northern England and covered much of the east coast and parts of modern Scotland. So it would have ended about where Edinburgh is today.
Yeah.
But Edinburgh would have been within Northumbria.
Yeah.
Modern York was at its southmost border. It was formed in the 7th century upon the unification of Bernicia and Deira, the northern and southern parts of the kingdom. The kingdom was traditionally at odds with Mercia, both consistently raided each other's lands and sometimes launched full-scale invasions. As you said, Mercia was a large kingdom, the most dominant up until Wessex really came into its own. Wessex was sort of seen as unstable but fertile country that covered most of the southwest. It was bordered by the Celtic kingdoms of Cornwall to the west, Mercia its north, and Kent to the east. As was the mode of period, Wessex was constantly at odds with its neighbours and actually dwindled as Mercia began to take some of its lands before King Egbert rose to power in the 8th century.
9th century.
Its economy and strength grew under Egbert with the acquisition of Surrey, Sussex, Kent, and Essex. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself there, so I'll leave that for later. The last big kingdom, obviously, is East Anglia, which was the smallest of the kingdoms, but powerful during the reign of the Woffingas dynasty. By the end of the 8th century, however, it had been subdued by the more powerful Mercia. East Anglia briefly did reclaim their independence in the 9th century, but very swiftly after that were conquered by the Danish Vikings.
Okay, so I think probably at that point, I suppose it's quite an irony in this, isn't there? Because it'd be interesting to know whether the people at the time considered themselves to be sort of settled English, if you like. Of course, there was no such thing as English, really, but settled, or whether they could see the irony that they themselves were invaders, and that they had only been in this country for a comparatively short period of time. Well, at the most probably 300 years by the time that the Viking incursions became quite significant, shall we say. Because in many ways the Vikings were simply doing nothing other than what the Anglo-Saxons did themselves. So tell us a bit about why the Vikings came over, where they came from, what sort of people they were, how they were perceived, what their behaviour was like, and whether they deserve quite the bloodthirsty sort of image and reputation they have today.
Yeah, well, I think they do and they don't. I do think, as you said, it's massive to point out that they were no different than the Anglo-Saxons, really, the Vikings. And I don't just mean, culturally in terms of their DNA. I mean in terms of exactly their approach to Britain as a whole. So I know that nowadays, actually, some historians argue that the Anglo-Saxon invasion was maybe more brutal than the Viking one. Now, that's obviously up for debate, and we spoke a little bit about that last week. And obviously, nobody knows for sure with the current information. But the Vikings would have come from northern Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Their lands were very, very harsh, hard to farm. But they, by the sort of the 8th century, the Vikings had made pretty good networks, and they were used to trading with everyone from the Mediterranean, back and forth. So they were aware of Britain, but they'd never really landed there before. And obviously, it's all good and well saying they knew about Britain, but that doesn't mean that some chap that built a boat in Norway would necessarily know how to get to England. But I think what's interesting is most people think of the first account of the Vikings coming to Britain as Lindisfarne, but apparently that's actually not the case. The first account of a Viking raid in Anglo-Saxon England comes in from 787 AD, when 3 ships from what at the time was called Hordaland, which is in modern-day Norway, landed in the Isle of Portland on the southern coast of Wessex. Mm-hmm. They were approached by a thane called Beardaherd, who was the royal reeve from Dorchester, whose job it was to identify all foreign merchants entering the kingdom. Mm-hmm. So when he approached them, they simply just killed him. There was no chatting or talking about it. They just killed him. And they think that between then and Lindisfarne, it is likely that there were other raids. A lot of records obviously have been lost, so it's hard to know for certain. We do know that soon afterwards, in 792, King Offa of Mercia began to make arrangements for the defence of Kent from raids perpetrated by what he described as pagan peoples. So I think it's safe to say that Vikings were already making a name for themselves before the 793 AD famous attack on Lindisfarne.
Yeah, it's interesting. So the Vikings primarily came from 2 countries, didn't they? Denmark and Norway. Although, interestingly, for such a small country, I believe the Danish influence was greater. Is that right?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, as you see in shows like The Last Kingdom, and obviously I'm not saying that, The Last Kingdom, we should watch something like that for all of your historical knowledge, because things are obviously glammed up a little bit. But, the history is loosely pretty correct. So, I mean, the Anglo-Saxons would have referred to them, the Northmen, as Danes the most of the time, because that's what they were. You did have a lot of people from Norway. Obviously, as I mentioned, those people that killed that Saxon thane when they came to Wessex shores, they were from modern-day Norway. But they were largely known as the Danes. And as we know, as people with a lot of Manx blood, it was the Danes that settled the Isle of Man. And I actually think it's really interesting to mention, and I don't think this point is often got across, but the Isle of Man is actually by far the best place to find Viking archaeology on the whole of the British Isles,
Okay.
by far, both in terms of quantity, quality. Yeah, so but it's mainly Danish.
Okay. Yeah. So no Swedes, but that's interesting. So I wonder what the Swedish were up doing. I think they may.
No. Apparently there were Swedes. It's funny because you don't hear much account. I think
No.
probably because the Anglo-Saxons wouldn't have known the difference between a Swedish person and a Norwegian person, as probably neither did the Norwegian and Swedish people most of the time. But we do know that there's a group of 30 rune stones that was found in Sweden, which refer to the Viking Age voyages in England. They constitute one of the largest groups of rune stones in the world, and they are comparable in number only to the approximately 30, Greek runestone collections, for example. But yeah, these 30 runestones that were found in Sweden, refer directly to the voyages and the invasions of England. So we know that Swedish people did go there, and they returned to Sweden afterwards, and they writ down the tales of what happened there.
So did the Viking, let's call it the Viking immigration, did it follow the same sort of pattern as the previous Anglo-Saxon one, with warriors first, followed by settlers, or was it rather different?
Yeah, it would have been like that. I think it's worth mentioning that the Viking invasion was obviously nowhere near as smooth as the Anglo-Saxon invasion. The Anglo-Saxons pretty much moved in and said, like, I'm the daddy here.
Yeah.
There's a new daddy, there's a new sheriff in town.
Yep.
Whereas, the Vikings, they sort of picked around the coast, around where from the south coast to the sort of the northeast coast, everywhere really. They sort of picked away, little invasions here and there. They often targeted Christian sites. I think it's worth mentioning, I think sometimes the Vikings were almost seen as like anti-Christian.
Yes.
They could care less about Christianity. The only reason that they targeted these sites is because they were undefended. They didn't specifically do it to be like, devil worshipping anti-Christian folk.
Yeah,
it was purely. Sorry.
No, I think it's worth pointing out that it's interesting because the Anglo-Saxons, of course, themselves originally had exactly the same beliefs, with no difference whatsoever. The gods were exactly the same gods. The superstitions were the same superstitions. Probably the songs they sang and the sagas would have been very similar, or the same sagas. And of course, what happened over the period we're in today is the indigenous Anglo-Saxons became largely a Christian people, which set them in very stark contrast to the invading, let's call them Vikings for convenience now. And certainly in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles and in the writings available of the day, the Anglo-Saxons themselves very much saw themselves as the civilized Christians fighting against these sort of terrible, horrible pagans, and it was sort of incumbent upon them to uphold God's law, sort of thing. And I think the Vikings, quite rightly, just sort of laughed at them and obviously believed in their own gods, and as you say, they opportunistically, the church has always been very good at building up wealth. They have disproportionate wealth, and so they were the obvious place to attack to get the wealth. So anyway, so in our remaining slot for today, I think we've got about 15 minutes to go. Be good to talk about the areas of England that the Vikings, well, not just England, of course, because the Vikings are still highly influential in places, as you say, the Isle of Man, Orkney, and of course later on, Ireland, arguably the capital of Viking Europe was Dublin. Certainly by the time we get to the 9th century. So tell us a bit about which parts of England in particular that the Vikings settled in, and how they settled, how it expanded, and how their land was referred to at the time.
Yeah, sure. just quickly before I get into that, I do, really want to hammer in that point you made about how similar the Viking people were to the Anglo-Saxon people, sort of only like 100 or 200 years before the Vikings came. I mean, Christianity at the time, not to be rude, was very, very pompous, and it was so fear-based. I mean, the only reason that these monasteries and stuff weren't defended was because people were brought up to be so afraid of God that nobody would dare ever take a gold coin from a monastery or something like that, because they would be told, read verses from the Bible talking about Abaddon, the angel of death, coming to flay them alive or whatever, and that would be enough to turn you off, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
But whereas the Vikings, obviously, as you said, just laughed at that. They believed in their own gods. They thought that the Christian attitude was very silly, and probably I expect a lot of them actually thought it was quite brutal, which is funny considering how people perceived them. But yeah, so the Vikings raided Lindisfarne. Other noteworthy places that they raided was Iona in Scotland, Iona Abbey off Scotland's west coast. It was attacked several times, 802 AD, 806. 68 people were killed. The devastation was so bad that the community at Iona abandoned the site and actually fled to Kells in Ireland. In the first decade of the 9th century, Vikings raiders started to attack the coastal districts of Ireland. By this point, the Danes had pretty much taken over the Isle of Man. I think it's important to note, though, that there was the invasion of the Isle of Man. It wasn't. I want to say it wasn't brutal. There would have been a lot of men that were killed, but the Viking men married all Manx women. It's not like they brought their women with them and they all suddenly made it as Viking Isle. So the Isle of Man, to this day, they very much can see themselves as sort of like a Viking Gaelic people, and you see that very much in their society. So I've been to the Manx History Museum several times, and they've actually got a very, very good exhibit on the Viking era that talks about how men obviously would have been out hunting and fighting and stuff like that, and women would have brought up the children learning both, Manx and Danish, Manx Gaelic and Danish, and the language to a certain extent did intertwine, and they would have taught them about the Manx history and stuff like that. But then obviously the father would have came home in the evening and would have told them all the sagas and the stories that they would have grown up with in Denmark. So it wasn't like savagely brutal. I think getting back to the point, sort of the invasion really started to take place in sort of about 865, 896 AD. The Norse attitude towards the British Isles changed from sort of like a pillaging mindset to a place of potential colonization. As a result, large armies began to arrive on Britain's shores as opposed to sort of pirate bands. Obviously, Norse armies captured York, which was the major city kingdom of Northumbria. They captured that in 866. Counterattacks concluded in a decisive defeat for Anglo-Saxon forces at York on the 21st of March in 867. And the deaths of Northumbrian leaders Ada and Othbert took place. Other Anglo-Saxon kings began to capitulate to the Viking demands and surrendered land to the Norse settlers. Many areas in eastern and northern England, including all but the northernmost parts of Northumbria, came under the direct rule of Viking leaders or puppet kings.
Yes, I think eventually we end up with a very large part of England referred to as the Danelaw. So Mercia was basically cut in half. I think it was called the Five Kingdoms. I can't remember I think it's Leicester, Stanford, Derby, and two other towns I can't remember today because I should have done my homework better. But so I think say Mercia saw about half of its land taken by the Danelaw. You effectively almost had the original north-south divide, and that actually very much has continued to today. So if you think about, I think of a good example. Probably one of the greatest rugby league players of all time was a guy called Paul Sculthorpe, Skulthorpe is a Viking name, for instance. So if you look at the place names in the north, they are almost predominantly Viking-based names. The people are more Viking-based, and you can see actually a slight difference in genetic makeup. I think profile. Of course, you only get people like you and me who are basically like neither one thing nor the other. We're like all sorts. Uh, you know, so I've got I think every single part of DNA from a British person you could have. So we're able to cross over.
Interestingly, what surprised you was you actually had a DNA test, didn't you, a couple of years back? And what you were surprised to hear was actually predominantly you did actually have Norse DNA, didn't you?
Well, I had only 8% English DNA. That was the most interesting thing.
Yeah. What was it? It was almost like 70% Norse or something, wasn't it? Something quite crazy, really like.
Well, they obviously don't know where. North European is, is so.
But it insinuates, obviously, sort of. You think you obviously what comes to mind is Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, doesn't it?
I don't think it was 70%. If I remember rightly, it was something like 30-odd% Scando and 30% Gaelic-y. Yeah. So
I think it might have been like 40% Viking, 30%. I remember thinking it was predominantly.
Yeah. So I'm according to the DNA test, I'm essentially a sort of a Viking Gael. Much more.
I think it's important to mention though that very, very much British. By obviously the time you get to the end of the Viking era, anyway, you're very, very much a British person. You don't really go out of those shores much, do you? You're either Norse, Gaelic, which is obviously people associate more with places like Ireland's the Isle of Man and stuff, but very much Gaelic, Norse with some Anglo-Saxon, with some ancient Britain, which is very obviously relevant to our show.
Yeah, I think sort of building for the future. Of course, this whole 8-part series builds right up to that cataclysmic sea change in English and British history when we have the Norman Conquest. And of course, one of the things that's fascinating, which I'm really looking forward to talking to you about, is actually predominantly the perception of people in history about what happened there is fundamentally wrong, because that whole battle essentially was won between Viking-dominated peoples against Viking-dominated peoples. And of course, what happens very much through the period we're in, and certainly coming out the other side, is that you start to get this concept of Englishness as opposed to, hello, I'm a Saxon, you're a Dane. People start to work together. But of course, bringing today's show to an end, so we've got a situation effectively where the Vikings have come, they're powerful. We haven't really mentioned the appeasement policy. The first Neville Chamberlain of England. So the incumbent kings used to pay them tribute, which was called Danegeld. So basically, it was like, we'll give you all our money if you bloody well leave us alone, you please.
Yeah, sure.
And of course, the Vikings would take all the money, and then a year later, they'd come back, go sucker, sail back up the river, and do it all over again. Which just goes to show that giving in to blackmail and that sort of thing is never a very good recipe. So we end up in a situation where the Vikings are. Certainly by, say, 870, looking quite pretty. They're sitting there dominating half of what's England today, I would say. And you've got the Mercian influence retreating. I know you wanted to talk a little bit about Egbert, so very quickly, if you could just do, because most people listening to this won't know who Egbert is.
Sure. If
you could just do a 2 or 3 minute little summary about the importance of King Egbert, please, Callum.
Yeah, no, definitely. I know that obviously the show Vikings has become very popular, so the King Egbert that we're talking about now is the same King Egbert from the show. So as I was saying about the Last Kingdom earlier, it's a good base for learning your history, but take into account that everything's glammed up a little bit. But the King Egbert that they show in the program is very much the King Egbert of history. What you were saying a second ago about how, the attitude to the Vikings of, pay them some money, hope they go away, was really absolutely rubbish, because as you said, they would just come back a year later and slaughter everyone and then ask for some more money. But I think King Egbert was undoubtedly a very, very strong man, a very powerful man. He was the grandfather of King Alfred the Great, and there is no doubt that King Alfred wouldn't have been the man he was without his grandfather, and he'd certainly had a lot of his grandfather in him. By the time of Egbert's death, he was actually he was written. It was written that by his enemies that he was king of all Britain. So that just goes to show you what his enemies actually thought of him. These are from direct. Yeah, these are from direct historical accounts. But a real quick rundown. He was born in Kent, and when King Beorhtrych of Wessex died in 802, he basically said, "I want to be king of Wessex. My ancestors were the richest and the most successful kings of Wessex, even though I was born a Kentish man. So I think that I have the best claim."
Yeah.
The Mercians, though, supported another man, and basically said, "Egbert, you better get lost or we're going to kill you." So Egbert went into exile and actually lived with Charlemagne for many years. Charlemagne supported Egbert, but basically not enough to intervene on his side militarily. Anyway, Egbert returned from exile and became king of Wessex when the Mercian supported king died. He then, in 825, won a decisive victory over King Beornwulf of Mercia, Ellendon. This is when Wessex became the dominant kingdom, and pretty much would do onwards from that. Following his conquest of Mercia, Egbert controlled all of England south of the Humber. In 829, Egbert defeats the Northumbrian king at Dore near Sheffield. In 830 AD, Wiglaf of Mercia revolts, but Egbert subdued him. In 830 AD, Egbert subdued all of northern Wales, and was recognised by the Welsh as the overlord of England.
The North Welsh.
In 836, Egbert suffered his only major defeat. Actually took place in Somerset, which is obviously relevant for us. For anybody listening that's not aware, we are Somerset people. So Egbert was defeated by the Danes at Carhampton in Somerset, which was a big blow for him at the time, and a lot of his army was destroyed. But he made a big comeback in 838. The Cornish made an alliance with the Danes, and a huge Cornish and Viking army came up from the southwest. But Egbert completely defeated the whole Cornish Viking army and basically sent them running back to Cornwall. Just a year later, Egbert died and was succeeded by his son Ethelwulf.
Yes.
But I think the most relevant thing for us, what we were saying about when the Danes invaded what is modern day Carhampton, it was called Charmouth at the time. They had a fleet of 36 ships. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle entry for that year states how a great slaughter was made there, and the Danes remained masters of the field, indicating a significant victory for the Viking raiders. So it really was a blow to Egbert at the time, but it shows his character, that completely unfazed. Within a year, he had completely reasserted his dominance.
Okay. I think, so it was nice to see the passion for the character there. So wrapping up to today, I think we're in the final minutes now. So I think what we've seen Wessex emerge as the powerhouse of England, but in highly troubled and difficult times. And by the time we get to 878, which is where we're going to start next week's show, we have a situation where the English, if they exist, are in complete disarray. And where we're going to leave you today is King Alfred becomes the King of Wessex. We're doing a complete whole special on King Alfred next week, so you have to wait till next week to find out everything about him. So for today, we're just going to set the scene. So King Alfred has become the King of Wessex. and his early reign was, to say troubled would be an understatement. And certainly by the time we get to the end of today's show, Wessex's prospects of triumphing would have been as bad as England's in the Second World War, I would say. I think that would be a good comparison. And so by 878, we have the Wessex army is in complete disarray. The whole of the structure of Wessex has disappeared. All the other kingdoms don't exist because they've been subjugated by the Danes, and Alfred himself has to retreat to the marshes of Somerset, which I'm very, very proud about, centering around a place called Athelney. And of course, because in those days Somerset was so largely underwater, people would travel around principally on coracles, etc., and it was very, very easy to hide. So Alfred, with an unknown number of retainers, retreated to Athelney, and basically sat there and just hoped. It'd be interesting to know. Nobody will ever know whether he actually thought realistically he was going to be able to triumph. So we end today with Alfred in Athelney burning the cakes, or did he? The prospect of England as a nation is in tatters. It looks almost certain that Vikings are going to win, and that today's show would have been talked to you in Norse. But we'll see what actually happened, won't we, Callum? Well, I have to say, it's a really good job. It's always fascinating to listen to the vast knowledge you have of your subject, and it's lovely to see the passion that comes out when you're talking about things you really believe in. So thank you very much, Callum.
Thank you.
I think it's a really good tour of the period from 600 up to 878. We hope you liked it, listeners. We've basically got really good theme music today, as you'll see, so I hope you really like it. It's called Blood Swan, and I think it's quite relevant for the period. So until next time, when we see the fight back of the English and the true emergence of us as a nation, have a great week. It's been a pleasure. Thanks. Bye.